National Season Halftime Recap. I want to break down the Nationals format from the Nationals that have happened so far. And I just want to see what's going on here. Because I honestly, as of now, I think that's going to be our Nationals format as well for like the big Nationals, right? And even though some of the smaller Nationals, you know, you might say, oh, Sweden only had 88 players or this tournament only had 100 and something. Each individual National might not matter as much, but I think all of them combined paint a pretty good picture. So let us begin by very quickly recapping the first couple weeks up until this last weekend. Overall, there were 6 Nationals before this weekend and 5 Nationals on this last weekend. The 6 Nationals before this weekend have been won by Kashira, Sprite, Branded, Labyrinth, Kashira, and Sprite. So before this, it was looking like Kashira was still the best deck, but Sprite was also still taking home some national championships. And then Super Heavy Samurai, as you can see down here in the top cut breakdown overall, even though up until this point, even including this last weekend, so after 11 Nationals total, Super Heavy Samurai is the second most topping deck, but it has not won a single national. Because apparently Super Heavy Samurai is a deck that's really good at getting you to the top cut of an event. It's definitely strong at that. But 25 Super Heavy Samurais have topped these national tournaments, and not a single one of those has won a national championship in Europe. In the meantime, Sprite has 11 national tops and 3 national championships won by Sprite, which that's kind of insane. That's an insane conversion rate from topping to actually winning. I think that story checks out, honestly, because Sprite, I find a deck that is very hard to build for a very, very diverse metagame, which is what we have right now, right? We have a decently diverse metagame. I don't think the metagame is as diverse as it was last year for Nationals, but for this year's Nationals, we still have like, I mean, you look at the top cut breakdown, Kashira, Super Heavy, Branded, Labyrinth, Mathmech, Purely Sprite, all those decks are to be expected, which is already 7 different decks in the top cut representation. And then there's some more that you face in Swiss. It's a relatively wide format. I'd say you have to be prepared for like 9 to 10 different decks. You're not going to face all of them, I think, in one tournament usually, but you have to at least consider like at least those 7 decks and then maybe some more. Which Sprite is not that great at handling that. Sprite has a lot of room for non-engine, which means it can counter like specific decks really well. If I want to counter Kashira with Sprite, I can do that, but then my other matchups are going to suffer. But what that means is that when you make it to top cut with Sprite and you play against mostly Super Heavy Samurais and Kashiras and maybe some other decks, at that point, if you've built your deck to beat Kashira and Super Heavy Samurai, I think you have a very decent chance at actually winning the event. I think that's why Sprite is not topping as much. Like, it's only the 7th most topping deck out of all these, but it has won the most championships, tied with Kashira. And that's why I think Sprite decks are not as good as getting you through a super diverse Swiss bracket, but they are decent at getting you through a top cut that you can know what to expect. Also, paired with the fact that Sprite players are all absolute giga chads, so of course they're winning tournaments. Kashira, super well positioned in the format. Most tops, most wins, not much to say about it. I mean, it is just solid, right? If you want a deck that has like solid chances of getting you into top cut and solid chances for you to win the event, Kashira is good. Super Heavy Samurai, on the other hand, is getting a lot of tops, but has not been able to clutch it out, at least in Europe, to actually win a tournament. I know it was in the finals in Israel. I think it's been in the finals in other countries as well. It's gotten close, but it's not been able to pull it off, which I think the main difference between Kashira and Super Heavy Samurai when it comes to actually closing it out is that Super Heavy Samurai is, at least from my point of view, what I'm observing right now, honestly, one of the most prepared for decks in the format. Could be the players playing it. Maybe it's also the type of players that choose to play the deck. But from my perspective, it's like everyone is focusing on hand traps a lot in their decks, right? We saw this last format where hand traps weren't like mandatory. I feel like this format, everyone is just terrified of Super Heavy Samurai. Like, people just hate to get full comboed on going second and they can't do anything about it, right? People just hate that. right? And so everyone is doing Droll, everyone is doing Gamma. People are playing Ghost Ogre, even though that card is really mediocre against Kashira. Kashira is the most played deck, the most topping deck, and people are still putting Ghost Ogre into their main decks because they just hate the idea of losing to Super Heavy Samurai. They just don't want to lose to it, right? And so people don't, right? People are topping with lists that have a lot of hand traps, and so you top with Super Heavy Samurai, you just have a problem, right? You just play against those decks that are all prepared for Super Heavy Samurai. And that's what it is. That's why they're losing. At some point in Top Cut, you're going to lose the dice roll, or you're going to get Droll and Lockbirded in game 3, or you're going to get Ghost Ogred, or whatever, and you're just going to lose, right? That's just what happens, I think, if you play Super Heavy Samurai. It's a deck that is, yes, you can play a lot of hand traps yourself, but for good reason, we didn't play that many hand traps last format. Hand traps are not ideal against the other decks in the format. They're not bad. That's why people can still play them and main deck them and do well with them. Hand traps are fine, but they are at best against Super Heavy Samurai. And then if you're playing Super Heavy Samurai, you cannot really play the cool board breakers for the other matchups. You have to only rely on hand traps, which, like I said just now, hand traps are not ideal against the other decks, which is why we didn't play as many last format. We played other cards, like we played a lot of Evenly, we played a lot of Talons, we played a lot of Thrust even for going second. There was a lot of options like Books, all those cards that are good into the other decks, which is why we played them before Cyberstorm Axes. Super Heavy Samurai can't play them. They can't really side them either. You can't side an Evenly matched in Super Heavy Samurai, which is a card that you are definitely missing for these other matchups. So I think that's why Super Heavy Samurai is not converting into winning tournaments. Branded is still on the rise, 14 tops, third most topping deck. It is a development that I think we've talked about before, where Branded was very popular at some point, and everyone started playing Ash, and Branded started to drop in popularity. Now, two things have happened, I think. Branded got support, which it doesn't make the deck completely broken, but it helps. You know, support is always good. Quem is a really good card. The new Albion fusion is also very good. So Branded support helped it, and I think people have gone away from certain anti-branded cards in their main and their side deck. Of course, Ash is still a very popular card because it's Ash, but I see a lot of decks who are like, hey, I decided to play Droll instead of Ash because it's better against Cash and Super Heavy Samurai. I decided to play Ghost Ogre instead of Ash. I decided to play Imperm instead of Ash. And if you do that, those cards are better into the other matchups. They're better against Kashira, they're better against Super Heavy Samurai, but they're worse against Branded. So I think Branded is feeling really, really nice in this like third best deck position, right? Branded is really comfortable not being the most respected deck. That's where Branded really comes through and takes a couple of even tournament wins, right? Because people might just not be prepared for it in their main and side anymore. If you look in details, it feels like Branded mostly topped the smaller nationals with less rounds. I think Branded has a very similar situation than Sprite. Like what I said earlier about Sprite, I think also holds true for Branded, because in Swiss, you will still face, I think, a lot of Ashes, right? Because the average players are still going to be on Ash. A lot of rogue decks are going to be on Ash. But then when you go to Top Cut, if you can make it with Branded, I think you have a decent chance at winning a tournament, because there's a very high chance that people in Top Cut got to Top Cut or are winning in Top Cut because they're focusing on beating Kashira and Super Heavy Samurai, right? If you have Ash in your deck and you make it to the Top Cut of a tournament, you are more likely to lose to Kashira or Super Heavy Samurai than if that card was Droll and Lockbird. Does that make sense? If you make it to Top Cut, you rather have Droll and Lockbird in your deck. I think that's a fair statement to make. And I think that explains why Branded, if it makes it to Top Cut, it has a good chance of converting to a win. The exact same thing is true about Labyrinth, but in a different way. Labyrinth has put up, honestly, an impressive amount of tops that I was not expecting. It's basically on par with Branded in terms of tops and wins, and it's topped more than Sprite and won 2 nationals even. I think that is for 2 reasons. First reason, people are finally starting to play the furniture build, which, first of all, is incredibly more fun and more interactive, but it's also really, I think it's really good. And then the second reason is just very simply, I don't really think people have the means to really prepare for Labyrinth in a way where I don't think cards like Evenly, cards like Lightning Storm, cards like Feather Duster are super, super popular right now. The same as the cards versus Branded. If you're looking at this format, you have so many other decks to also prepare for. for. You have to prepare for Kashira for sure. You have to prepare for Super Heavy Samurai. People also really respect stuff like Mathmech in their side decks. Like I see a lot of Bystials. You have to care about Purely. You have to care about this and that and this and that. And like, is there really room in your side deck for a card that only works against Labyrinth? Like Lightning Storm is not really good in any matchup except for Labyrinth. And Evenly Matched is okay in a lot of matchups, but it's only really good against Labyrinth. It seems like people are not really focusing on Labyrinth in their side decks, which is fair enough, and that's why the deck is coming up. Spell and Trap removal isn't even that good versus the Furniture build. Ash is like the best card. That is also true. Mathmech next. Troll Despair. We'll talk about Mathmech. I'll give you my honest opinion on why Mathmech is topping and not winning. This is actually not hate. I think Mathmech is a very good deck if you want to top a tournament because it does what it does, right? It plays a fair amount of hand traps or non-engine. You have a lot of room to customize Mathmech. And then if you draw those non-engines plus Mathmech Circular, your deck is really strong. And you are just statistically likely to do that, like, I don't know, 10 rounds. It's very likely that you can do that in like 8 rounds out of 10, which is topping probably. 8-2 is probably a topping record. And Mathmech is consistent enough for you to do that, to achieve those numbers. The reason why I don't think Mathmech is winning tournaments is I think it's kind of similar to Fluandereeze, even though it's not as bricky as Fluandereeze, but it's kind of the same problem. I think at some point in Top Cut, you just are destined to either not open Circular, or you just get Bystialed in game 2 or 3 when you go first and you die, right? And so like Mathmech, I think is very bad in single elimination because there are definitely games where Mathmech just lets you down. It was the same with like Flunder, where like at some point in Top Cut, you would just not open Robina and that was that. Game was over. Or Zombie World, right? When Flunder was really popular, every tier player was on Zombie World. So like, even if you can beat your top 64, top 32, and top 16 opponent with Flunder, at some point, someone is going to have a Zombie World against you. And I think the same is true for Mathmech. I think that's why Mathmech is topping, but not winning. Simple as that. Purely is kind of like middle of the pack in terms of performance, right? It's not topping as much, but it did manage to win a tournament, which we're going to look at the deck list in a bit. I don't think it's top tier. I don't think it's bad. I think it's middle of the pack. I think it's not as explored as the other decks because it does have that problem where the deck is really expensive. I think Purely is more expensive than Kashira, and it might even be more expensive than Super Heavy Samurai. And so like, if you look at those numbers, you're thinking from any player's perspective, why would I invest in Purely? And so Purely, I don't think is getting the representation that it would need to properly shine, because I do think Purely is a good deck. And you can see that because honestly, I would assume that out of all of these decks, I think Purely is the least played one. I think it's close between Lab and Purely. There's no shot it's branded. People love branded, dude. And people also love Sprite. There's too many Giga Chats. In Spain, Purely was not popular, and all the players I know either topped or bubbled with it. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm trying to get to. I think if you compare the Purely topping numbers to the other decks, they really are not impressive. But if you think about the fact that I don't think many people are playing Purely, I think the conversion rate for Purely is pretty strong. Make of that what you will, but out of these 7 decks, if I had Nationals this weekend, without much testing yet, I have not decided yet on what I'm going to play for German Nationals, but if it was this weekend, if I had to decide right now, I would play Purely. German Nats is still like, it's in 4 weeks. It's not decided yet at all. This is just my first impression of the deck. I like the deck. I think it's very flexible. I like that it has a couple of cool lines when you go second, like the Happiness OTKs, the Zeus lines. I like it going first. I like its options going second. I like that it can play a lot of non-engine. I'm happy with the concept of Purely. I don't think it's the best deck out of all these, like in general. I don't think it's fair to say that Purely is a better deck than Kashira. I think Kashira is a very good deck. You can't deny it. Kashira is the best deck. I just personally don't like playing Kashira, which is why I would probably go with Purely right now. But that's that. And then chat, out of all these decks, there is 2 others I want to mention if you're preparing for Nationals right now that I think you should have on your radar, maybe as an option. At the very least, you should know what they do and how to play against them. Rika and also Runic Variations. I don't think those 2 decks are dead, only because they don't appear in like the top 7 topping decks. I think those 2 are worth mentioning when you talk about like preparing for the upcoming format. I would classify Dragon and Sword Soul as like rogue-ish right now, but they are playable. You are right. Dragon Link and Sword Soul are something you could play against for sure. What about Punk? I think Punk Gold Pride has not performed. I would not recommend Punk Gold Pride, which is what I expected personally. All right, that's the overall gist of the halftime recap of Nationals. I think a lot of the numbers are very interesting to look at. I will say once again that I really want the ban list because I don't feel as excited for current TCG format. I think it's getting kind of stale with Kashira just being the top deck over and over and over again. I don't think this format is that bad. Honestly, if you've lived through the hell that was last year's national format, I think this one is so much better in comparison. It's not my favorite format of all time. It's not a great format. It's not something I'm gonna go back to in a couple years and be like, hey, yeah, let's play that format again. Nah, but I can live with it. It's all right, you know? At least I didn't bring Libromancer. Hey, look, Libromancer is a base deck. I wish they got more support.